The elevator jolted, then stopped between floors, lights flickering above us. I had 6 minutes to reach the stage door. A stranger's laugh cut through my panic like sudden sunlight. "Guess we're both trapped tonight," she said, grinning at me. 30 minutes passed, and somehow I forgot to be afraid. When the doors finally opened, I already missed her. I never got her name before the crowd swallowed her whole. 3 weeks later, she walked into my dressing room like fate. "My name is Mia Alvarez, 29 years old, a paralegal by day and an actress by night at a small Chicago theater on Halsted Street." I had spent years hiding parts of myself from my family, telling myself that someday, when the timing felt right, I would finally be honest. The night of the elevator, I'd been rushing to perform in Hearts on Halsted, our theater's original play about love and belonging in the neighborhood I called home. The stranger introduced herself as Jordan Reyes, an architect who'd come to see the show her aunt was directing, though she admitted she barely knew the plot. We talked about nothing important: coffee, terrible elevator music, the smell of stale popcorn. Yet somehow 30 minutes felt like the fastest half hour of my life. When the doors opened, stagehands rushed me to makeup, and Jordan disappeared into the crowd before I could ask for her number. I performed that night distracted, scanning the audience for a face I'd only seen under flickering emergency lights. 3 weeks passed before she reappeared, knocking on my dressing room door with a paper cup of coffee and an apologetic smile. "I forgot to say thank you for the company," Jordan said. "So I brought a peace offering. Extra sugar. Just in case." I laughed harder than the joke deserved, mostly from relief that the elevator hadn't been some strange fever dream. She admitted she'd asked her Aunt Diane, the director, to find out which actress had been stuck with her that night. That confession made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years, hopeful and terrified all at once. We started meeting for coffee after rehearsals, always with some excuse about lighting design or set construction Jordan claimed to care about. I told myself it was friendship, even as I began rearranging my schedule around her visits without fully admitting why. One evening she walked me to the L train, and neither of us moved to say goodbye for almost 10 minutes. Standing under the streetlight, I realized I hadn't felt this kind of nervous, giddy attention in longer than I could remember. Jordan started showing up to every rehearsal, sitting in the back row with a sketchbook, claiming she was working on an unrelated project. I caught her staring more than sketching, and when our eyes met she never looked away first, which unsettled and thrilled me equally. My best friend Carla teased me mercilessly, saying I smiled at my phone like a teenager whenever Jordan's name appeared on the screen. I brushed off Carla's comments, insisting Jordan was simply a new friend, though even I didn't fully believe my own explanation anymore. On a rainy Tuesday, Jordan showed up with an umbrella and walked me the 6 blocks home, our shoulders bumping the whole way. We ducked into a diner to escape the downpour, ordering pie we didn't finish because we were too busy talking to eat. She told me about her work designing affordable housing, how she believed buildings should feel like they were built for real people. I told her about growing up watching my mother clean other people's houses, promising myself I'd build a life with more room to breathe. Jordan listened without interrupting, and something about the quality of her attention made me feel truly seen for the first time in years. Weeks blurred into a routine of rehearsals, coffee, and long walks along the lake, each one edging closer to something neither of us named. I hadn't dated anyone seriously in 2 years, ever since a relationship ended badly under the weight of my own unspoken fears. My mother, Elena, still asked weekly when I'd bring home a nice young man, and I still gave her vague, deflecting answers. I hadn't told her, or anyone in my family, that I was gay, terrified of how it might rearrange every relationship I valued. Only Carla knew the truth, sworn to secrecy since college, the one person who never once made me feel broken for it. One night after rehearsal, Jordan and I sat on the theater's fire escape, sharing a bag of chips and watching the sunset over rooftops. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. and my stomach dropped the way it does before stepping on stage under bright, unforgiving lights. She admitted she liked women. Had known since college. Though her family back in Ohio still didn't know the full truth about her life. Something in me cracked open with relief. And before I could stop myself, I told her my own secret, quiet and shaking. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then she reached over and laced her fingers through mine like it was the easiest thing in the world. Neither of us said the word date, but somehow every outing after that felt like exactly that. Unspoken and electric. She started leaving little sketches in my dressing room, small drawings of the theater, of the lake, once even of me mid-laugh. I kept every single one, tucked inside my script, pressed flat like pressed flowers I couldn't bring myself to throw away. On opening weekend, she brought flowers backstage. Sunflowers because she said they reminded her of how I lit up a room. Carla caught the exchange and pulled me aside, grinning, whispering that she'd never seen me this obviously, hopelessly smitten before. I denied it out of habit, but even as I spoke the words, I knew I was only fooling myself now. Jordan and I started spending nearly every evening together. My apartment slowly filling with her jacket, her books, her particular brand of coffee. One night, cooking dinner in my cramped kitchen, she turned from the stove and simply said, "I really like you, Mia." I set down the wine glass in my hand before I dropped it, my heart pounding louder than the sizzling pan beside us. "I really like you too," I finally said, the words feeling both terrifying and like the truest thing I'd said in years. She crossed the kitchen and kissed me softly, and for one perfect moment, every fear I carried about my family went quiet. We became official that night, though we agreed to keep things private while I figured out how and when to tell my mother. Jordan never pushed me to come out before I was ready, which somehow made me want to be braver for her sooner. We spent Sundays at the farmer's market on Halstead, holding hands only once we were safely inside the gay-friendly neighborhood we both loved. Outside that invisible boundary, we let go of each other's hands, a small daily grief neither of us spoke about out loud. My grandmother, visiting from Milwaukee, mentioned once that Jordan seemed like such a good friend, and I laughed to hide how much that stung. I started rehearsing conversations with my mother in the shower, in the car, in the mirror, never quite finding the right words. Jordan's Aunt Diane, the theater director, figured us out within a month, catching us sharing a private smile during set changes. Diane never said a word about it, just started scheduling us for the same tech rehearsals more often than seemed accidental. For my birthday, Jordan planned a quiet dinner on a rooftop overlooking the skyline, string lights strung between two brick chimneys. She gave me a small silver ring, not an engagement ring, she clarified quickly, just a reminder that she was choosing me daily. I wore it on a chain under my shirt for months, close to my heart but hidden from anyone who might ask questions. Our life together felt like a secret garden, beautiful and alive, but fenced in by walls I hadn't yet found the courage to tear down. Then Jordan's company offered her a promotion, one that would mean designing a major community center right there in our own neighborhood. She was thrilled, already sketching ideas for a building with a rooftop garden and a mural celebrating the block's long queer history. I felt proud watching her dream out loud, and for the first time I let myself imagine a real future built around us both. It was during this hopeful stretch that the first crack in our happiness appeared. Quiet at first, easy to ignore. Carla mentioned, almost casually, that she'd seen my mother having coffee with a woman none of us recognized. Deep in conversation. I didn't think much of it then. Distracted by rehearsals for our theater's biggest show yet. A story about two women finding each other. Diane had written the play herself. Inspired, she said, by someone she once loved and lost long before Chicago ever felt like home. I didn't yet know how closely that story would end up mirroring my own family's buried history, waiting patiently to surface. My mother started asking more pointed questions about my friend Jordan. how often we saw each other, and why I hadn't dated men lately. I deflected each time, but the excuses grew thinner, and I could see suspicion sharpening behind her careful, patient smile. Jordan's ex-fiancé, Alex, resurfaced unexpectedly, calling to say he'd be in Chicago for a conference and hoped they could catch up. I hadn't known Jordan had been engaged to a man before realizing she was gay, and the news landed like a small, cold stone. Jordan explained quickly that Alex was the reason she'd finally admitted the truth to herself, though the breakup had been painful for them both. Though jealousy crept in uninvited, and I found myself asking questions I didn't love the sound of in my own voice. "You're allowed to have a past," Jordan reminded me gently, though I noticed she avoided answering exactly when Alex was arriving. The community center project brought new pressure too. Long nights at the office that left Jordan exhausted and distracted during our time together. I told myself the distance was temporary, just a busy season, though a small worry took root that I tried hard to ignore. Carla, meanwhile, had grown quieter around me, no longer joking about Jordan the way she used to. Her smiles thinner than before. I later learned Carla had been struggling privately, passed over for a promotion she'd worked years toward while I seemed to be thriving. Resentment, turned out, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently for a moment to do the most damage. One Sunday, my mother invited me to lunch alone. No siblings. No small talk. Just the two of us at her kitchen table. "Rosa mentioned something," she said carefully, referring to my aunt, "about you and that architect girl being more than friends." My stomach dropped through the floor. I hadn't told Aunt Rosa anything, which meant someone else had spoken before I was ready. I later confirmed it was Carla, drunk at a work party, who'd let it slip to a coworker connected to my extended family. I confronted Carla, hurt and furious, and she finally admitted she'd been jealous, tired of watching my life look easier than her own. "That's not an excuse," I told her, my voice shaking. "You took something that wasn't yours to give away." We didn't speak for 2 weeks after that fight, the longest silence in a friendship that had survived nearly a decade already. Meanwhile, my mother's questions turned to quiet disappointment, then to careful distance. Dinners growing shorter, phone calls growing rarer. "I just don't understand," she said one evening. "Why you couldn't tell me yourself. Why I had to hear it from someone else." I tried to explain the fear that had kept me silent for years, but the words came out clumsy, defensive. Nothing like I'd rehearsed. Jordan, sensing my family crisis, offered to step back from public events, worried her presence was making everything harder for me. I told her that wasn't the answer, though privately I wondered if distance might make my mother's anger easier to survive. Alex's visit finally happened, and Jordan invited me along, insisting there was nothing to hide and nothing left unresolved between them. Watching them together, easy and familiar from years of shared history, stirred an insecurity I hadn't fully examined until that dinner. Later that night, Jordan asked why I'd been so quiet, and instead of answering honestly, I snapped that she still cared what Alex thought. It wasn't fair. And I knew at the moment the words left my mouth, but pride kept me from taking them back. We argued for the first time. Voices raised. Old fears about visibility and shame tangled up with newer fears about trust. "I am not hiding anything from you," Jordan said. "But I can't fix your relationship with your mother by disappearing from mine." She left my apartment that night, and I sat alone on the fire escape where we'd once shared our first real secret. For 3 days we barely spoke, each of us too proud, too raw, to be the one who reached out first. My mother, unaware of the fight, called to say she needed more time before meeting Jordan, before accepting any of it fully. I told her I understood, though something inside me quietly broke a little further, exhausted from being patient on every side at once. Then, noticing the tension backstage, pulled me aside and admitted she'd once lost someone she loved by staying silent for too long. Don't let fear write your ending, she said. I did that once. And I've regretted it every year since. Her words stayed with me long after rehearsal, echoing through the sleepless nights that followed our unresolved fight. On the fourth day, Jordan showed up at my door with sunflowers, the same kind she brought that first opening weekend. I don't want to lose you over pride, she said. Mine or yours. And something in my chest finally loosened. We talked for hours. Honestly this time. About jealousy. About family. About the different kinds of fear we'd both been carrying alone. I apologized for the things I'd said about Alex, and she apologized for not realizing how exposed I felt around her past. We agreed to face things together instead of separately, though neither of us could have predicted how quickly that promise would be tested. A week later, my mother called again, her voice tight, asking me to come to Sunday dinner. Family only. No exceptions. I arrived to find my father unusually quiet, my siblings exchanging glances, the air thick with something unspoken and heavy. My mother finally set down her fork and said she'd told my grandmother everything. And my grandmother had not taken it well. Grandma Ruth had grown up in a small town, in a different era, and her disapproval was sharper than I'd ever expected. This isn't how we raised you, she said, refusing to meet my eyes, and the dinner table fell into painful, ringing silence. I left that night feeling like a stranger in my own family, wondering if the life I wanted meant losing the one I already had. Jordan met me outside, having waited in her car the entire evening, and simply held me while I finally let myself cry. That night I realized loving someone honestly might cost me people I'd loved my whole life, and I had to decide if I could bear that price. Rehearsals intensified as opening night for Hearts on Halstead approached. The play's central story eerily close to my own unfolding life. Diane, watching me struggle through an emotional scene, finally admitted the play was based on her own decades-old love story, unfinished and unresolved. She had once loved a woman named Teresa in this very city, before family pressure and fear convinced her to walk away for good. I built this play because I couldn't build a life with her, Diane said quietly. Don't make my mistake, Mia. Her confession settled deep in my chest, a warning and an invitation to choose differently than she once had. Meanwhile, Aunt Rosa called me privately, saying she'd found an old shoebox in my mother's closet while helping her clean. Inside were letters and photographs from decades ago, including one of my mother, young, laughing, arm in arm with a woman named Teresa. I froze, staring at the photograph on my phone screen, recognizing the same name Diane had spoken just days before. Rosa admitted she'd always suspected something, a closeness between my mother and that woman that never quite fit the family's usual explanations. I didn't confront my mother immediately, uncertain what to do with a truth this fragile, this potentially explosive, this deeply hidden. Jordan encouraged me to wait, to let the information settle, warning that forcing a confrontation might only make my mother retreat further. Meanwhile, Jordan's own family situation grew complicated when her parents announced a surprise visit from Ohio for the community center groundbreaking. She hadn't come out to them yet either, terrified of losing the quiet, steady relationship she'd always had with her father especially. I keep telling myself I'll do it next time, she admitted. And next time never comes. The way it hadn't for you either. Watching her fear mirror my own made me feel less alone. But it also made the ground beneath us feel more uncertain. Carla reached out again, asking to meet. Admitting she'd spent weeks in therapy unpacking why she'd hurt someone she genuinely loved as a friend. I agreed to meet her at our old coffee shop, cautious but willing to hear her out after everything that had happened. She apologized without excuses this time, and slowly, carefully, we began rebuilding something that had cracked but hadn't completely shattered. The groundbreaking ceremony for Jordan's community center arrived, drawing local news cameras and a crowd larger than either of us expected. Jordan's parents stood proudly in the front row, unaware their daughter had built more than a building into that quiet Chicago block. I stood near the back, introduced only as a friend from the theater, a label that stung more than I let myself admit. After the ceremony, Jordan's mother approached me, warm and curious, asking how long I'd known her daughter and what I did for work. I gave careful, vague answers. Watching Jordan's tense shoulders from across the crowd, both of us performing a script neither of us had written. That night, Jordan broke down in my arms, exhausted from hours of hiding in plain sight in front of the people she loved most. "I'm so tired of choosing who gets to know the real me," she said, and I held her. Understanding that exhaustion completely, we made a quiet decision that night. After opening weekend, once the play wrapped, we would both tell our families everything. Together. Setting a date gave us something solid to hold on to. A light at the end of a tunnel we'd been walking blind through. Rehearsals for the play's final week grew intense, Diane pushing me harder in the climactic scene where my character finally speaks her truth. "You have to mean it," Diane told me during one exhausting run-through. "The audience will know if you're still hiding something." I realized I'd been performing the character's courage without accessing my own, protecting myself even inside a story about finally being brave. The night before dress rehearsal, my mother called unexpectedly, her voice softer than it had been in months, asking if we could talk. I braced myself for another difficult conversation, but instead she asked simple questions, careful ones. About Jordan, about happiness, about my life. It wasn't full acceptance. Not yet. But it was a door cracked open after weeks of a closed, locked silence between us. I almost mentioned the shoebox, the photographs, Teresa's name. But something told me the timing still wasn't right for that conversation. Opening night arrived faster than I felt ready for. The theater filling with familiar faces, including, to my shock, my entire family. My mother had bought tickets without telling me, bringing my father, my siblings, and even Grandma Ruth, stiff and silent in the third row. Jordan's parents sat several rows back as well, having decided to stay in Chicago an extra week to see her friend's theater debut. Backstage, my hands shook as I applied stage makeup, aware that tonight's performance would blur dangerously close to my real life. Carla found me in the wings, squeezed my hand, and whispered that whatever happened, she was proud of how far I'd come. Diane gave her usual pre-show speech, then added quietly, "Just for me. Tell the truth tonight. Mia." On stage and off, the house lights dimmed, the audience quieted, and I stepped into the wings for my opening scene, heart pounding against my ribs. The first act unfolded smoothly, the audience laughing and gasping in all the right places, unaware of the storm building off stage in my chest. Then came the climactic monologue, the one Diane had written from her own unfinished love story, the one I'd rehearsed 100 times. Standing under the lights, I looked out and found my mother's face in the third row, still waiting. The scripted words suddenly felt too small to hold everything I needed to say, and I made a decision in that instant. I stepped slightly forward, breaking the fourth wall in a way we'd never rehearsed, and spoke not just as my character, but as myself. "I love a woman named Jordan," I said, my voice carrying across the silent theater. "And I'm done pretending that isn't true." Gasps rippled through the audience, and I saw Jordan rise slightly from her seat, eyes wide. Before Diane gave a small, encouraging nod from the wings, I found my mother's eyes again, and for a long, terrifying moment, neither of us moved, the entire theater holding its breath with us. Then, slowly, deliberately, my mother stood up in the third row, and I had no idea if she was about to leave or stay. My mother didn't leave. Instead, she began clapping, tears streaming down her face, until the rest of the theater rose with her. I finished the scene in a daze, barely remembering the final lines. my whole body trembling with relief and disbelief. Backstage after the curtain call, my mother pulled me into the tightest hug she'd given me since childhood, both of us crying. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "I loved someone once too. A woman named Teresa. Before your father. Before everything." Hearing her say the name aloud, unprompted, confirmed everything Rose's shoebox had hinted at, and suddenly her years of silence made painful sense. "I was so afraid of the same things happening to you that happened to me," she admitted. "So I stayed quiet instead of brave." Grandma Ruth approached more slowly, her expression unreadable, and for a moment I braced myself for rejection instead of embrace. "I was wrong 40 years ago. And I was wrong last month," she finally said. "I don't want to be wrong again with you." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was more than I'd ever expected, and I let myself accept it as a real beginning. Jordan pushed through the crowd backstage, and in front of everyone, including her own startled parents, she kissed me without hesitation. Her mother gasped audibly, but her father, surprisingly, simply nodded slowly, saying, "Well, that explains the sketchbook full of theaters." Jordan later told me her parents needed time, real time, but that night they didn't walk away. And that felt like enough for now. Carla found us in the chaos, hugging me fiercely, saying she'd never been prouder to call me her best friend. Diane watched from the wings with tears in her eyes, later telling me she felt like she'd finally finished the story she'd started decades ago. The next morning, local papers ran a small piece about the community theater's daring new production and its unscripted, viral opening night moment. My mother invited Jordan to Sunday dinner for the first time, nervous but determined, setting an extra place at the table herself. Dinner was awkward at first, careful and overly polite, but by dessert my father was asking Jordan detailed questions about building foundations. Grandma Ruth said little, but she passed Jordan the mashed potatoes twice, which in our family was its own quiet form of acceptance. Weeks later, my mother showed me the rest of the shoebox, old letters from Teresa, describing a love she carried silently for decades. "She married someone else eventually too," my mother said. "We wrote for years, then stopped. Then I heard she passed a few years back. I asked if she regretted her choices, and she admitted she did, though she said watching me be brave had eased some of that old grief." Jordan's parents called a month later, inviting us both to Ohio for a visit, tentative but genuine, a door opening slowly on their side too. The community center Jordan designed broke ground fully that spring, and she added a small rooftop garden dedicated quietly to people who loved bravely. Diane retired from directing that season, handing me unofficial leadership of future productions, saying I understood the material better than anyone now. Carla and I grew closer than before, our friendship stronger for having survived betrayal, honesty, and the hard work of forgiveness. My mother started attending Halsted Street events with me, awkward but present, slowly learning the neighborhood I'd loved in secret for years. One afternoon she admitted she kept a photo of Teresa in her wallet again, no longer hidden, just quietly, finally, remembered. Jordan and I moved in together that autumn, filling a small apartment near the lake with her sketches and my dog-eared scripts. We hung the sunflower drawing from that very first bouquet in our hallway, a small reminder of how far 3 years had carried us. On the anniversary of our elevator meeting, Jordan surprised me by recreating the moment, trapping us both in a rented, motionless elevator for old time's sake. "I have something to ask you," she said, kneeling awkwardly in the cramped space, laughing at how unglamorous the setting truly was. I said yes before she finished the question, both of us laughing and crying in an elevator for the second time in our lives. We were married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the theater where we'd first fallen in love without quite realizing it. My mother walked me partway down the aisle, Grandma Ruth sat in the front row, and Diane read a passage from her own old, unfinished love story. Jordan's parents came too, still learning, still adjusting, but present, which was its own quiet, imperfect kind of victory worth celebrating. Carla stood as my maid of honor, reminding the room in her toast that the truest friendships survive their worst mistakes. Looking around at everyone who had once doubted, feared, or hidden from this exact moment, I felt something settle fully into place. I had spent years afraid that honesty would cost me everything, but in the end, it gave me back a family I'd almost lost. I used to think love had to be hidden to be safe, quiet to be acceptable, small to be forgiven by the people I loved most. Now I know real love is loud, visible, and unafraid, and I finally get to live inside that truth every single day. Andy.